Americans love using their credit cards, the most secure and hassle-free way to pay. But D.C. politicians want to change that with the Durbin-Marshall credit card bill. This bill lets corporate megastores pick how your credit card is processed, allowing them to use untested payment networks that jeopardize your data security and rewards. Corporate megastores will make more money, and you pay the price. Tell Congress to guard your card, because Americans lose when politicians choose. Learn more at guardyourcard.com.
Today's episode contains a quotation with offensive and derogatory language. We have decided to include the quotation in its original form for historical accuracy, but do advise our listeners to listen at your own discretion. What is art without the muse? Many of Western art's most famous works are depictions of women. But who were these women? Do they have their own stories to share with the world? Hello and welcome to ArtMuse, a podcast that aims to reshape the ways in which we interpret well-known works of art by paying dues to the women whose images have been immortalized, but whose names and stories have been wrongfully overlooked. While these women's faces are familiar to viewers around the world, their identities have been largely forgotten. Together we will explore the important lives and legacy of the female muse and appreciate these works of art from a new perspective, through the eyes of the women whose image stares back at us. Is the muse in actuality just as, if not more, important than the artists themselves? And I'm your host, Grace Anna. Welcome to part 2 of our 2-part episode on Dido Elizabeth Belle. In part 1, we explored Dido's beginnings, her mother's enslavement, and her father's capture of the slave ship that held her, the many mysteries surrounding Dido's birth, and her father's radical decision to bring Dido and her mother back with him to England. We then explored Dido's upbringing at Kenwood House, Lord Mansfield's important presiding over the Somerset case, and how Dido may have influenced his revolutionary decision. We left things off in our story after an in-depth examination of Dido's only surviving portrait, and the many ways in which Dido's depiction defied contemporary convention. The year after Dido's portrait was painted, a riot would take place in London that would turn her and the Mansfields' lives upside down. In June of 1780, the London Protestant Association led a riot of 60,000 men towards Parliament in protest of the Catholic Relief Act, a new law that lessened restrictions on Catholics. Though Lord Mansfield did not directly rule in favor of the Catholic Relief Act, his decisions tended to provide relief towards Catholics, which contributed to the act being passed in Parliament. Because of this, angry mobs specifically chose Lord Mansfield as their primary target for their rage. After circling the Parliament building for a few hours, these protesters made their way towards Lord Mansfield's townhouse in Bloomsbury. To their dismay, they did not find Lord Mansfield at his home. Instead, they were met by a terrified Lady Mansfield, Lady Elizabeth, and Dido. We can only imagine the sheer terror that ran through their bodies as they watched infuriated protesters smash their homes' windows, break down their front door, and storm up the stairs. As Lady Mansfield, Lady Elizabeth, and Dido clung to each other in fear, they would have seen these protesters loot their home, with a later reported $30,000 worth of property taken. They also would have watched as mobs ransacked Lord Mansfield's personal library and burned thousands of his volumes in a massive fire. We know from a newspaper article covering the attack that Lady Mansfield had to escape their home through the back door, and we can assume that Dido would have been right behind her. The ambush on their home was so intense that eventually the National Army was called to shut it down. Though miraculously Lady Mansfield, Lady Elizabeth, and Dido were left physically unharmed, we can only imagine how traumatic the ordeal must have been. It certainly had an immediate and negative effect on Lady Mansfield's health, which sharply declined in the aftermath of the riots. That winter, Lady Mansfield suffered a drawn-out and serious illness, which lasted through the following year. Lord Mansfield, who adored his wife, spent every day at her bedside tending to her every need. We can imagine that Dido would have joined him on many of these occasions, helping in any way she could. Unfortunately, Lady Mansfield would never recover, and she passed away from her poor health in 1784. Her death was utterly devastating for the family, and in particular for Lord Mansfield, who was completely overcome with grief. How did Dido feel as she said goodbye to the woman who had mothered her for most of her life, who took her in despite the fact that she was both illegitimate and born into slavery, who raised her as Lady Elizabeth's equal and went out of her way to make sure that Dido was always well taken care of? We can imagine that Dido felt Lady Mansfield's absence in every aspect of her life, and would have been just as heartbroken over her loss as Lord Mansfield himself. Sadly, Lady Mansfield would not be the only beloved family member Dido would have to say goodbye to. Just a year after Lady Mansfield's death, Dido's dear cousin and closest companion, Lady Elizabeth, became engaged and was shortly after married to a man named George Finch Halton. Her wedding took place in December of 1785, a ceremony we are not sure that Dido was allowed to attend. Lady Elizabeth soon after moved out of Kenwood House, leaving a saddened Dido behind. How did Dido feel to say goodbye to her lifelong companion? To see the girl that she had grown up with, shared her life with, and loved like a sister, leave the home that they lived in together for over 20 years. Was Dido happy for her cousin? Or did she feel that she had been abandoned? And as she watched her cousin embark on this new stage of her life, did Dido reflect upon her own life? That as a biracial and illegitimate child, she may never be able to get married herself? Did she fear that she might end up completely alone? Luckily, for the time being, Dido was not completely alone. Though she remained at Kenwood House without Lady Elizabeth, she did still have the company of Lord Mansfield. Now just the two of them, Dido and Lord Mansfield took comfort in each other's presence. As Lord Mansfield approached his 80s, Dido became his primary caretaker. Each morning she read Lord Mansfield his newspapers and assisted him with his daily tasks. And when he developed rheumatism, Dido also began to help Lord Mansfield with his correspondence. Unable to write his own letters as his health worsened, Dido became Lord Mansfield's personal amanuensis, transcribing letters on his behalf. Well-educated as she was, Dido had impressive penmanship and a clear and neat hand. But it was very unusual for a woman to be assigned such an important task, let alone a woman who was still considered a slave by colonial law. Lord Mansfield very easily could have hired a male secretary or clerk to assist him. But instead, he made the deliberate choice to trust Dido with the job. It's nothing short of remarkable to imagine Dido helping Lord Mansfield, the most powerful judge in all of England, write letters to the country's most influential men about matters of the utmost importance. And what's even more remarkable is that Dido's involvement was not something that Lord Mansfield hid from his contacts. At the end of one such letter, Lord Mansfield had Dido include the addendum, "This was written by Dido. I hope you will be able to read it." Clearly a joke, because Dido's penmanship was impeccable. Though made in jest, this comment attests to just how proud Lord Mansfield was of Dido, taking any opportunity he could to praise her. How did Dido feel to be writing letters to England's most powerful men? To be privy to the country's most important matters? Did she feel a sense of power as she stamped and sealed each envelope? Did she smile to herself, knowing that her country's leaders were holding letters written by her very own hand? It comes with no surprise that Dido and Lord Mansfield grew even closer during these years. Appreciative of her care and company, Lord Mansfield showered Dido with even more affection than before. There are records of Dido receiving a number of expensive presents on top of her annual allowance and holiday gifts. And for her birthday each year, Lord Mansfield bought her 5 guinea pigs, an exotic pet that only the most privileged owned. If Dido suffered any ailments, she was always more than well taken care of. In fact, we know that in 1789 she had 2 teeth extracted, a procedure for which we can imagine she received top-notch medical treatment. But the most significant way in which Lord Mansfield showed his gratitude for Dido was by writing her into his will. As he aged, Lord Mansfield prepared for the inevitable end of his life and began to organize the division of his many assets. In his will, he made sure that Dido was well provided for, leaving her a sizable annuity that only got larger as the years went on. As they spent more and more time with another, Lord Mansfield amended his will to increase Dido's inheritance. In one such codicil, he bequeathed Dido an extra £300 per year, stating, "I think it's right, considering how she has been bred and how she has behaved, to make a better provision for Dido." He also set aside a one-time sum of £500 for her to receive upon his death, equivalent to approximately £40,000 today. A clear indication of his love for Dido, Lord Mansfield additionally left Dido a portrait of himself, painted by the acclaimed portraitist Jean-Baptiste Van Loo. As his will instructs of the portrait, "Hang it in Dido's room to put her in mind of one she knew from her infancy, and always honored with uninterrupted confidence and friendship." The fact that Lord Mansfield asked that his own portrait be hung in Dido's room so that she can always be reminded of him is a testament to their special bond. And Lord Mansfield's choice of wording is noteworthy as well. In his will, he specifies that Dido honored him with her uninterrupted confidence and friendship. Given that he was a lord, and she by law both a slave and illegitimate, it would have been far more acceptable for him to say that he honored her. But as author Paula Byrne rightfully points out, for Mansfield to say that Dido honored him with her confidence and friendship gives an intimation of the deep affection and respect that he held for her. Clearly, to Lord Mansfield, Dido's friendship was an invaluable honor and something he cherished deeply. And most importantly, in his will, Lord Mansfield officially granted Dido her freedom. This confirms that up until his will was issued in 1793, Dido was legally a slave, and Lord Mansfield must have worried for her safety after he was gone. He wanted to be sure that Dido was guaranteed her freedom and to protect her rights as a free woman. Despite his revolutionary rulings, Lord Mansfield clearly did not trust that Dido would be safe without further legal protection. In one final act of love, Lord Mansfield did all he could to ensure Dido's safety for the inevitable impending day when he could no longer protect her himself. But as Lord Mansfield got his affairs in order, Dido's biological father would actually pass away first. After leaving Dido in the Mansfield's care, Captain Lindsay was transferred to the East Indies, where he eventually became a commander-in-chief. He was later appointed as a Knight of the Bath, and towards the end of his career, commanded a fleet in the Mediterranean. In 1768, he married a woman named Mary Milner, but marriage did not stop him from producing more illegitimate children. In fact, after Dido, Captain Lindsay went on to have 4 other illegitimate children with 4 different mothers, 3 of which were of African descent. Sadly, we do not have much information on who these children were, nor what became of them. But it's certainly clear that Captain Lindsay made a habit of engaging in sexual relations with enslaved women, whether consensually or not. Eventually, Captain Lindsay's adventurous lifestyle started to catch up with him, and by 1784, his health began to decline. He passed away a few years later in 1788 at the age of 51. Quite remarkably, Dido was mentioned in his obituary, published in the London Chronicle. As the obituary read, "He has died, we believe, without any legitimate issue, but has left one natural daughter, a mulatta who has been brought up in Lord Mansfield's family almost from her infancy, and whose amiable disposition and accomplishments have gained her the highest respect from all his lordship's relations and visitants." It's extraordinary that Dido was so openly and publicly mentioned as Captain Lindsay's natural daughter, despite being both illegitimate and a slave by law, and that she was only one of his 5 children listed. But the obituary also gives us valuable insight into Dido's personality. Here she is described as both amiable and accomplished, and that she has earned Lord Mansfield's highest respect, a man the public would have known as being of great importance. That Dido is described in print in such laudatory terms speaks to just how important she was to both Lord Mansfield and Captain Lindsay. But despite her mention in his obituary, Dido was left completely out of her father's will. Not only was she not mentioned by name, but she did not inherit any of his assets. This evidently had little to do with her being illegitimate, as his 4 other illegitimate children were left with £1,000 each. It's more likely that Captain Lindsay presumed that Dido would have been given a substantial inheritance from Lord Mansfield, and would have been well provided for. We do not know how close Dido was to her father, or if he ever visited her at Kenwood House over the many years that she lived there. It does beg the questions. How did Dido feel about her father's death? Did he feel like a distant figure, or had they developed a close relationship? Would she miss him, or was she indifferent to his passing? And how did she feel to be left out of his will? Though Dido did not inherit anything from her father, she would receive a lump sum of money when a few years later Lord Mansfield passed away. By 1785, Lord Mansfield's health began to steadily decline. Suffering from increasingly severe rheumatism, he had no choice but to retire from his role as Lord Chief Justice of England. He spent his final years at Kenwood House with Dido, until he passed away in March of 1793, at the age of 88. He was buried with England's most prestigious society members at Westminster Abbey, a funeral we are not sure that Dido would have been allowed to attend. How did Dido feel to have to say goodbye to the man who had taken her in more than 30 years prior? Who had cared for her as his own child, despite her race and circumstance? Who was so inspired by his love for her that he instituted some of the most important legal protection for slaves in the history of England, who she had kept company in his late years and tended to as his health worsened with age, who had kept her safe at Kenwood House from the often unforgiving world around her. Was she now terrified to imagine a life without him? Dido's life would change drastically in the aftermath of Lord Mansfield's death. To start, she became a woman of considerable wealth nearly overnight. She was not only allotted £300 per year, but was given a one-time initial payment of £500 for immediate use. Dido soon found herself better financially off than most other aristocratic women. To think that a woman born into slavery now had more personal wealth than the white society women around her is quite extraordinary. And more than this, Dido's inheritance granted her financial freedom for the first time in her life. Her money was her own and no one else's. And of course, she did not only gain financial freedom, but once Lord Mansfield's will was instated, Dido was officially a free woman and no longer considered a slave by law. But despite her newly inherited wealth and freedom, Dido would have to say goodbye to the place she had called home for over 30 years, Kenwood House. Without Lord Mansfield there to protect her, Dido had no rights to the estate and was expected to leave shortly after his death. Not only did she lose the man who had taken care of her since infancy, but now also the place he had kept her safe in for over 3 decades. We can only imagine that Dido felt conflicting emotions over all she had gained, as well as all she had lost. How did Dido feel to come into money of her own? Did she feel a sense of liberation? Could she believe that she would now be considered a wealthy woman in her own right? And how did Dido feel to finally be a free woman? Did she heave a deep sigh of relief? Or was the pain of losing Lord Mansfield, as well as her home of over 30 years, too great for her to count her newfound blessings? Did Dido leave Kenwood House with a broken heart? We'll continue our story after a brief word from our advertisers.
Americans love using their credit cards, the most secure and hassle-free way to pay. But DC politicians want to change that with the Durbin-Marshall credit card bill. This bill lets corporate megastores pick how your credit card is processed, allowing them to use untested payment networks that jeopardize your data security and rewards. Corporate megastores will make more money, and you pay the price. Tell Congress to guard your card, because Americans lose when politicians choose. Learn more at guardyourcard.com.
Hey listeners, Grace Anna here, host of ArtMuse. I wanted to share another art-centered podcast with you called The Art of Crime, a podcast that delves into the unlikely collisions between true crime and the arts. Host Gavin Whitehead shares extensively researched episodes with gripping stories bringing art history and true crime together in a brilliant way. Learn about the attempted assassination of Benvenuto Cellini, the various artists who have been accused of being Jack the Ripper, or Madame Tussauds and her Chamber of Horrors, among many other fascinating topics. The Art of Crime podcast is currently in its 4th season, which focuses on art-related crimes in New York City. To learn more about the Art of Crime podcast, you can visit their website at www.artofcrimepodcast.com or find them on all streaming platforms where you can listen and subscribe. Welcome back, listeners. Now let's dive back in. It remains unclear where Dido went after she moved out of Kenwood House. We know that she did not stay with her cousin Lady Elizabeth, despite how close they had been as girls. As a single woman, Dido must have known that the surest way to secure her future would be to find a suitable husband. But at over 32 years old, Dido was well past the marrying age. So it comes with some surprise that Dido was married a mere 9 months after Lord Mansfield's death. On December 5th, 1793, Dido married a Frenchman named Jean d'Avenay. Jean d'Avenay was born in 1768 in Normandy, France. He moved to England as a young man to work as a steward to a lord. Though technically a servant, a steward was the highest position within the household staff and considered a prestigious post. As steward, d'Avenay would have been responsible for overseeing an entire estate, making sure it was running to the best of its ability. We do not know how Dido and Jean d'Avenay first met, but the likeliest scenario is that d'Avenay worked for Lord Stroman, the Earl who took over Kenwood House after Lord Mansfield passed away, as we know that Lord Stroman had a number of French servants working with him at this time. It's possible that Lord Stroman may have intentionally introduced Dido and Jean d'Avenay, or that they met as Dido prepared her leave from the estate. We also know that Dido and Jean d'Avenay belonged to the same parish, and it's equally possible that they met at church. Dido was undoubtedly taught French as part of her extensive education, which would have allowed the two to better communicate and connect. But Dido and Jean d'Avenay were certainly an unlikely pair. To start, d'Avenay was white, as well as 7 years Dido's younger. He must have been accepting of or willing to overlook Dido's mixed heritage and older age. Like Lord and Lady Mansfield many decades prior, Dido's marriage was unusual in that she was significantly older than her husband. We can imagine that Dido's natural beauty, intellect, and newly inherited wealth may have helped win d'Avenay over. Unfortunately, not only do we not know the circumstances under which Dido and d'Avenay first met, but also how Dido felt about him. How did Dido and d'Avenay first connect? Was it love at first sight, or was it a union of convenience? Was Dido swept off her feet, or was she trying to find a means to survive? Could she believe that she was getting married, despite her age and circumstance? And how did Dido feel as she said "I do" to not only d'Avenay, but to a whole new chapter of her life? And so Dido was married in December of 1793 at St. George's, Hanover Square, one of the most popular churches in all of London. Her marriage certificate, signed by Dido's own hand, is one of the few surviving documents we have from her life. Though she signed as Dido Elizabeth Belle, records show that she changed her last name to d'Avenay shortly after their wedding. About a year into their marriage, Dido gave birth to twin boys, whom she named Charles and John. Both boys were baptized on May 8, 1795, at the same church Dido was married in. Tragically, John does not seem to have survived infancy, and his death must have been unimaginably heartbreaking for Dido. But she did go on to have another boy a few years later, whom she named William, after Lord Mansfield. We can imagine that little William was Dido's own tribute to the man who had taken care of her when she needed it most, and a way to keep Lord Mansfield's memory alive. Dido and her new family settled into a middle-class community in Pimlico, which at the time was considered to be on the outskirts of London. The area was largely rural, with wide-reaching fields and modest farmhouses. Using the money she inherited from Lord Mansfield, Dido was able to purchase one of these small homes for her and her family. Though a far cry from Kenwood House, her new home would have been more than comfortable, with 2 bedrooms and a private garden. Her annuity from Lord Mansfield was enough to cover the household expenses, and she may have even been able to afford a female servant to help her with general upkeep. But most importantly, for the first time in Dido's life, she had a home that was fully her own. She would never again have to remain hidden when guests arrived, or fear she could be asked to leave at any time. We can imagine, as Dido watched her boys play in their private garden, that she felt a sense of relief, knowing that they would enjoy a freedom and safety that she herself never had. And Dido was not only able to provide her sons with a comfortable and safe home, it seems that she also went out of her way to invest in their education. Records show that both Charles and William were sent to Belgravia House School, a prestigious private school primarily for boys of the upper class. Here her sons would have been taught to read and write, become proficient in Greek, Latin, and French, taken classes in mathematics and accounting, and even trained in academic drawing. Knowing the importance of a well-versed education firsthand, Dido must have wanted to give her sons all the tools they needed to be able to succeed in life, especially in the ways that she herself could not. There is so much we do not know about Dido's life at this time, and what her day-to-day experience was like. In Pimlico, she would have lived in a community with a mix of professional and tradespeople. But given her unique background, we have to wonder how well Dido would have fit in with her neighbors and adjusted to her new life. Though biracial, Dido likely would have struggled to feel a sense of belonging within London's Black communities, given her unusually privileged upbringing. At the same time, it would have been equally challenging to be wholly accepted by white middle-class communities, given her mixed race. Where did Dido feel a sense of belonging? Who did she feel most comfortable with? Where was Dido most accepted? We can imagine, given her unusual story, that Dido may have felt a sense of alienation as she tried to integrate into her new life. That while her upbringing and education would have made her more than comfortable within the white aristocracy, she could not escape the prejudice against her race and status, and the very things that may have connected her to the white upper classes would have alienated her from Black communities. We also have to wonder what the experience of being in a mixed-race marriage was like at the time, and how accepted a relationship like Dido's would have been. Mixed-race marriages were not entirely unheard of in the 18th century, and because they tended to be amongst lower-class communities, they were generally accepted. But outside of sexual relations between white masters and slave women, most of these mixed-race couples were between Black men and white women. Dido's marriage to D'Aubigné differs from this norm in many ways. The fact that Dido, a mixed-race woman, was with a white man, and more than this, that she was their main financial provider, would have inevitably made their marriage less tolerated. And given their middle-class standings, their relationship would not have blended in as easily as other mixed-race couples in lower-class communities. How did Dido feel about being with the white man? Was she worried for their safety? That their neighbors may not have approved of their relationship? That their unusual marriage was yet another way in which she felt isolated from the communities around her? Or was her love for D'Aubigné strong enough to withstand society's scorn? Unfortunately, so much of Dido's personal experience has been lost to history, and the many mysteries of her life would continue up until her very end. In July of 1804, Dido unexpectedly passed away at the age of 43, of unknown causes. Some scholars have suggested that she may have died in labor due to complications trying to birth another child, especially at her older age. How did Dido pass away? What were her dying thoughts? In her final moments, did she reflect upon her life? Was she filled with a sense of happiness and completion? Or was she devastated to have her life cut so early? Dido was buried shortly after her death in St. George's, Hanover Square in Westminster, the same church that held some of her most significant moments: her baptism, her marriage, and later her children's baptism. It should be noted that Dido's grave was tragically exhumed in the 1970s due to redevelopment in the area. Her body was moved to an unknown location, where she remains today in an unmarked grave. Though her presence in Lord Mansfield's home helped shape some of the most important legal steps towards abolition, Dido would not live long enough to see the abolition of the slave trade, which would not take place until 30 years after her death. We can only imagine how devastated D'Avenant and their 2 sons must have been over Dido's passing. Now a single father, it was in D'Avenant's hands to give Charles and William the future Dido would have wanted for them. It certainly helped that D'Avenant inherited Dido's money, a sum large enough that he no longer needed to work. And fortunately, both Charles and William did go on to have impressive careers. Charles became a clerk for the East India Company when he was only 14, and was eventually stationed in India, where he was promoted to captain. And William became an Earl of Nottingham through marriage. Dido undoubtedly would have been proud that both of her boys led successful and fruitful lives. As for Dido's other legacy, her double portrait with Lady Elizabeth, the painting remained in storage at Kenwood House until 1925, when the estate was purchased by Edward Guinness, who would soon after open Kenwood House to the public. The portrait was brought with the rest of the Mansfields' belongings to Scone Palace in Scotland at this time, where it remains today. Here Dido would fade into history until she was rediscovered in the late 20th century. Up until the 1980s, Dido was presumed by the Mansfield family to have been a house servant or maid. This was supported by the fact that the painting's inscription only includes Lady Elizabeth's name. Dido thus remained nameless and overlooked for well over a century after her death, until research done by local historian Jean Adams uncovered Dido's identity. Using primary sources, Adams was able to not only identify Dido within the portrait, but make a case for her larger historical significance as one of the first aristocratic women of color from her era. A reproduction of her portrait now hangs in Kenwood House as a tribute to Dido and her incredible life. Since her rediscovery, Dido has begun to receive the attention she deserves. In 2006, a short film titled Dido Belle by filmmaker Jason Young was shown at the Battersea Arts Center. In 2007, an opera titled Spirit of the Middle Passage was written about Dido and performed by the Philharmonia Orchestra at Queen Elizabeth Hall. And most notably, in 2013, a feature-length biopic titled Belle, starring Gugu Mbatha-Raw as Dido, was released in theaters around the globe. And Dido continues to inspire art across the mediums. In 2013, author Caitlin Davies wrote the novel Family Likeness, based on Dido's life. In 2016, famed author Zadie Smith mentioned Dido's portrait in her novel Swing Time. And in 2018, writer Eva Dean Bygrave wrote the musical Fern Meets Dido, about a student who goes back in time and interacts with Dido. As author Paula Byrne eloquently wrote, Though Dido's grave is lost and she has no living descendants, her painting remains a testimony to her extraordinary legacy. Striding back from the orangery with her quizzical, dimpled smile, making no apology for her presence and her vitality, she lives on forever in this portrait, rising out of the darkness into the light. And so, the next time you look at David Martin's portrait of Dido and Lady Elizabeth Murray, think of Dido Elizabeth Belle, of her mother Maria's brutal capture from West Africa and terrifying journey across the Atlantic, of her father's discovery of Maria on a Spanish slave ship and their subsequent relationship, of Dido's mysterious birth at sea and her father's radical decision to bring Dido and Maria back with him to England, of her adoption by Lord and Lady Mansfield, who accepted her as a member of their family, of her luxurious childhood at Kenwood House and extensive education, of her bond with Lady Elizabeth, who she loved as a sister, of her special relationship with Lord Mansfield, who had so much respect for her that it influenced his revolutionary rulings against slavery, of Lady Mansfield's death and Lady Elizabeth's leave, and the many years that Dido and Lord Mansfield lived alone together, of Dido's important role as Lord Mansfield's amanuensis, writing letters to England's top men on his behalf, of Lord Mansfield's eventual passing, marking the end of her time at Kenwood House, of her unlikely marriage to Jean d'Avenir and start of a new life, of her sons, who she loved deeply and sacrificed for greatly, and finally, of her untimely end at the mere age of 43. And think of all that we do not know, of all the questions we wish we could ask Dido about her personal experience and inner feelings, of all the details of her life that have been lost to history, of all the secrets that now remain hidden behind Dido's mysterious painted smile. Which brings us to Dido's extraordinary portrait. In many ways, Dido's portrait is just as remarkable as her life itself. Not only was it practically unheard of for a woman born into slavery to be depicted as an aristocratic woman on canvas, but there are no other portraits to date from Dido's time to show a woman of color and a white woman as equals. Though Dido's depiction was not without its stereotypes, as her turban and basket of fruit allude to her otherness, her portrait was one of its kind in its revolutionary representation of a biracial woman as an equal member of an upper-class English family. Equally remarkable is the possibility that Dido's pointed finger may be referencing the Hindu deity Krishna and his lesson that all people are one and the same. With her finger, Dido may be communicating a similar message, that she and her white cousin are also one and the same. As Dido sprints ahead in her elegant gown and pearl earrings, she makes it clear with her glistening eyes and mystifying smile that she knows that she has defied all odds, both in her life and on canvas. Of course, her historical significance is also not to be overlooked. The fact that a girl born into slavery could be raised as a gentlewoman within one of England's most influential households is nothing short of astonishing. Dido, who for the entirety of her time at Kenwood House was technically a slave by colonial law, enjoyed privileges that most of England's white population could never even dream of. She was clearly a respected and trusted member of the family, and was given important tasks like running the estate's dairy farm and later in life, transcribing Lord Mansfield's letters. And though she wasn't allowed to attend most public outings with the Mansfields, nor have formal dinners with their guests, they still went out of their way to make it known that Dido was a cherished member of their family. Just as extraordinary is the possibility that Dido may have influenced Lord Mansfield's decision to establish legal protection for slaves in his famous case Somerset v. Stewart, and therefore the possibility that Dido indirectly changed the course of England's history. As author Paula Byrne wrote, "The story of Dido Belle and Lord Mansfield is about individuals who changed history. Would Mansfield have described slavery as odious and have made his significant ruling in the Somerset case if he wasn't so personally involved in the slavery cause as a result of his adoption of Dido? His description of the comparison of slaves to horses as shocking, his constant concerns for questions of humanity, are entirely consistent with his personal affection and respect for Dido. Her presence in the household and Lord Mansfield's adoption of her as a cherished daughter ensured that he viewed the atrocities of the odious slave trade through a personal lens, through the eyes of a much-loved young black woman. As if it were her fate, of all the households for Dido to land in, she happened to be taken in to the home of England's Lord Chief Justice, the most powerful judge in the entire country. And simply by being herself, she inspired some of the most significant steps towards abolition in England's history. But though Dido was the exception to the norm, her story cannot be removed from the dark history of slavery itself, from the innumerable black men, women, and children whose names have been forgotten and whose stories have remained hidden through history. As much as Dido's story attests to what was possible against all odds, we have to equally remember all that wasn't possible for so many others like her. As we honor Dido's life, we honor all of the lives of the people who were not as fortunate and were subject to the cruel and inhumane system of slavery. And in honoring the historical circumstances in which Dido lived, her story endures as a beacon of light amidst the darkness of her day. Dido's image, forever immortalized in her portrait, remains as a testament that one small girl, born into slavery, was able to change the world by the power of her magnanimous smile. I hope you have enjoyed ArtMuse's 2-part episode on Dido Elizabeth Belle. I've included images, resources, and suggestions for further reading on the ArtMuse website and Instagram. ArtMuse is produced by Kula Production Company. Today's episode was written by me, your host, Grace Anna. Stay tuned as I continue to share the stories of the women behind some of the world's most important works of art. Until next time, bye for now.
Americans love using their credit cards, the most secure and hassle-free way to pay. But DC politicians want to change that with the Durbin-Marshall credit card bill. This bill lets corporate megastores pick how your credit card is processed, allowing them to use untested payment networks that jeopardize your data security and rewards. Corporate megastores will make more money, and you pay the price. Tell Congress to guard your card, because Americans lose when politicians choose. Learn more at guardyourcard.com.